The cathedral smelled of lilies and old promises. Sunlight poured through stained glass like an accusation. I had rehearsed my smile in the mirror so many times it felt less like expression and more like technique, something to be polished and shown to the world. Etienne's hand in mine was cool, his smile pristine, and when the priest asked if anyone objected, I stared at the faces in the pews and found the word object in my throat and swallowed it whole. Then the engines came like thunder, and what had been a rehearsal imploded into life. Black cars slid to a stop outside. Men in tailored suits moved like clockwork. The doors of the cathedral burst open and the air changed, colder, charged, as if everyone had stepped into winter. Cameras flashed, phones rose, and in the doorway he appeared. Tall, coat dark as a bad omen, hands gloved, presence like a held breath. Dante Moretti walked in with 2 men on either side, and one of them, Luca, with eyes that softened when they caught mine for half a second. My scalp prickled the way it does when you see a storm on the horizon. Etienne's smile faltered. "Who?" he started, then stopped. Dante did not shout. He did not bawl or brandish. He walked to the front with the deliberateness of someone used to being obeyed. He said my name, Isabella Laurent, as if it had been a secret passed along at last. When he looked at me, I felt my name lived in him, like a possession and a question at once. "You're not safe here," he told me. The words were not a command so much as a blunt confession. My groom reached for me, and Dante's hand came up, not in violence, but in a controlled intercept. "Don't," Dante said to Etienne, and the word hung like a scalpel. The congregation inhaled. The organ cut off mid-note. There are 3 versions of every first impression: how you see someone, how other people tell you they are, and how you learn they are. I had always known Dante as rumor and regret. A name my father muttered once, the silhouette behind a shuttered window when I was younger. He had been the bad weather that circled around our family until it was only rumor, and then the police blotter. I had been taught to fear the name, to avoid it. And yet, when he stood in that sacred aisle, the thing I felt was not only fear, it was recognition. Something older than memory, sharper than logic, and cold enough to make the tip of my tongue tremble. He turned to Etienne as if he were inventory. "You've built a life on other people's ruins." The words were simple, and they broke something in the room. Etienne's hands curled into fists. My fingers tightened on his. "I won't let you." Etienne started, and then, as if in answer, guests rose like birds driven from a tree, whispers, accusations, then a chorus of cameras swallowing the moment. Dante reached for me. He did not yank me. He extended a hand. It was an absurdly polite gesture in the middle of chaos. My body did something traitorous. For years I had been threading my life through other people's designs. Here was a man who offered me the option of stepping out of the pattern. Everything inside me said run back into Etienne's arms. Everything outside of me, and a part of me that had sounded like truth, said that the house behind his smile had been hollow all along. "Come," Dante said, voice flat and steady. It felt like an offer of protection and a sentence at the same time. The aisle felt thin under my feet. My dress whispered over marble, fabric and white, and all the promises that had never been mine. I took a breath and I stepped. Behind me, Etienne shouted my name. Around me, people murmured. The cameras recorded everything and none of that felt real. My choice felt real. Dante's hand closed around mine. Not forceful, but authoritative. When his fingers wrapped around mine, I felt heat, like the press of a life raft against cold water. He led me away from the altar and toward the door where the cars waited, engines humming, men moving with the elegant brutality of trained violence. He helped me into the back of a dark sedan. The door shut. For the first time that day, the world was reduced to breath and the little space between us. His profile was a shadow against the window. Up close, I could see the scar beside his jaw and the faint line of an old regret in his eyes. He didn't ask me again if I wanted this. He shouldn't have needed to. "You shouldn't be here," I said, because the truth of it felt safe. "You shouldn't have been there," he corrected. He laid a single hand across my sleeve as if to steady me. An impossible, delicate thing, like someone offering a bandage for a wound that had been mine for years. The car moved through the city like a knife. It cut me away from the life I thought I would have, and brought me nearer to a person whose name I had learned to fear. At the villa, the gates opened as if to admit inevitability. The house was not a prison. It was a place furnished with absence. He showed me to a room that smelled of rain and old books. He left me with a tray as if he had not just unmade my wedding day. He left a photograph folded into my palm, Etienne and a man smiling as if they had planned the same funeral together. The clipping was yellowed. The memory was fresh. You ask why a woman would go with a stranger who calls her by the name rumor taught her to fear. The answer is not simple. It's the geometry of small betrayals, the accumulation of tiny deceptions. Etienne had been a man who loved the artifice of comfort. Dante had been a man who carried ruin with him and called it justice. Between comfort and truth, I chose truth. Abrasive and bleeding as it was, when Dante left me that night, the house exhaled. I listened to it and felt something like the first ache of new weather. Rain washed the roof all night, and in the morning the garden looked like it had been rinsed clean of pretend. I woke with my dress in tatters at my knees, laced like a map of a life I had thought I wanted. I wore the memory of Etienne's kiss like a bruise, and the memory of Dante's hand like an unexpected compass. When Dante entered the room the next morning, he carried coffee in the kind of composure that commands rooms without effort. He set the cup down and towed a photograph toward me on the tray. "You should know your future husband's ledger better than anyone," he said. His voice held no malice in that moment, only granite insistence. I unfolded the papers he left me. Receipts, names, transfers that mapped a route from bank to shell company to a country I'd only seen on maps. Under each number was a story Dante expected me to read. I read them and felt my stomach drop into an ocean of doubt. "You lied to me," I told him. The accusation a slow burn. He lied to me. The ash of it tasted like betrayal. "You were meant to be his shield," Dante said. The pretty face that kept the smoke from getting inside his plans. He looked at me then, not as a hostage, not as the woman whose day he'd interrupted, but as a person who had been used as theater. "You have the right to be furious. I was furious. I was hurt. But beneath that fury there was something that frightened me even more. Relief. The facade had cracked, and under the crack there was light, and more importantly, there was truth. He did not gloat. He did not fawn. He offered me the evidence, and he left me space to digest it. That restraint felt almost like chivalry, or like a man who had learned to place his pain inside discipline. "Why come to the wedding at all?" I asked later, when the kitchen had cooled and the rain had become a drizzle. "Why choose today to take your grievance public?" He watched me while he cut fruit, methodical and reserved. "Because you needed to see who you were standing beside. And because Etienne would have hidden it forever." His fingers moved quick and exact. "There's a history here that isn't yours to carry, but someone has to tell you." "You could have told me." The bitterness in my voice was not mine alone. "I tried," he said softly. "I sent warnings. I sent people. Your prison has many doors that only close behind you." He put down the knife and met my gaze in a way that felt like a confession. Maybe I came like a storm because storms have a way of clearing away the rot. "You came like a storm and offered me shelter," I said, and the irony of it made me laugh, brief and sharp. There was an ache in his face that softened him, made him less monster and more man deserving of pity. He sank into a chair across from me, and suddenly he seemed small under the ceiling, less untouchable. He told me about his brother, Matteo, and the way the boy had believed in good things in a business that swallowed faith for coin. He told me about the night the car exploded, about the slow unraveling that followed. Factual sentences made brittle by grief. When a man tells you the grief he has carried, you have a choice. You can close your heart, keep it in the armor you were taught to wear, or you can let the cracked places be filled by the words and the presence and the ache that looks disturbingly like longing. We spent the day in a cautious truce. I asked questions and he answered in fragments, each piece a small surrender. I learned that he had not come to steal me as an object, but to unmask Etienne. I learned that Luca was not a cartoon henchman, but a man who had once carried a bouquet to a funerary service and cried in the car on the drive home. As evening came, there was a dissonant lull. The house creaked, and a lamp threw a pool of light on the rug. Dante sat across from me, and for a long time we did not speak of the past. We only watched the small details. The way the light caught the scar at his throat, the freckle near my collarbone, the little habits that make a person human. "You hate me," he said finally. "I did," I answered without thinking. The word felt honest because it owned its evolution. I hated what you represented. I hated that you came and ruined a day everyone told me was supposed to be perfect. "And now?" he prompted, voice low. "And now," I said, which felt like opening a small window and letting the air rush in. "I don't know. I feel less certain of everything. And for the first time in a long time, that's not entirely unpleasant." He smiled then, a thing that rearranged his whole face. There was humility in it, something I had not expected, or permitted myself to expect. We were close then, the distance between us no longer hostile but deliberate. The kind of space two people hold when they are deciding whether or not to trust. My hand found his as if by accident, and he didn't pull away. We sat like that in the hush, palms touching. The contact so small it felt explosive. "Do you forgive me?" he asked, and there was vulnerability under the hardened syllables. "For what?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "For intruding, for unmaking the world I thought I had, for making me see, for being the man who broke my assumptions, for making you see," he said, "for everything I am." I wanted to say no, to be righteous and stubborn and bound to a life of rightness. I wanted to stay the free woman who would never be owned. Instead, the truth that lived under my tongue was simpler, more human. "I forgive you for not letting me sleep through my life," I said. The confession, soft, ridiculous, mortal, landed between us like a tether. He leaned forward and kissed me. It was not hunger. It was not cruelty. It was gentleness and a fierce relief. Our mouths met with the measured need of two people who had spent lives refusing to be known, and finally, inexplicably, chose each other anyway. When we broke apart, my breath came in a ragged laugh. "This started with hate," I said. "Are you aware of that irony?" "I am," he admitted. "I used to write oaths in vengeance. Now I find myself able to imagine other words." He tucked a stray wet curl behind my ear, as if we lived in a quieter life. His touch was reverent. "Stay," he murmured. "Tonight, stay." I could have left for the hotel, gone back to the life of perfectly arranged things and cold comfort. Instead, I rested my head against his shoulder and felt a strange, new thing. Not safety in the old sense, but companionship. A mutual choice, raw and fragile, like glass warming into something that could become a mirror. Outside, Paris exhaled the first warm breath after the storm. Inside, I wrapped my hand in his and realized that for the first time in a long time, I had chosen my own story rather than performed the part written for me. The music did not resume in the world I had left. It had been replaced by a new rhythm, a pulse that was uncertain and honest, and for reasons I could not yet explain, felt like the beginning. Rain had rinsed the worst of the city's shine away, leaving everything honest and a little raw. Days at the villa folded into one another. Interviews with men who wanted nothing and everything, papers poured over at a long oak table, Dante pacing like a caged tide. Nights felt like confessions in the firelight. Between that work and the quiet, a rhythm formed, not peace, but purpose. We started with little exchanges that felt like trade. A fact for a smile, a confession for silence. Luca began bringing me tea without being told. He handled the villa like someone who'd been born to its creaks and knew the place's secrets by heart. He and I fell into a companionable silence at odd hours. I would play a phrase on the piano, he would set another tray down. Dante watched us both, and sometimes I could see in his face that the habit of loneliness was hard to break. One morning I found a folder on my bedside table. It wasn't left there by the staff. Dante had a way of placing things where they would meet you. My name, written in his careful hand, sat on top of stacks of ledgers. The pages were a map of Etienne's life. Shell companies wired through luxury boutiques. Invoices with the names of people whose faces I'd never seen. Transfers to accounts linked to faces in photographs that made my stomach roll with recognition. Beneath numbers were notes, a shorthand of motives and threats. This was the truth he'd brought me to see. It read like a ledger of betrayal, and in the white margins, Dante had circled names I recognized, trailing arrows to a single ugly center. I folded the pages into my palm as if they were small, live things. When he found me there with the papers, he did not ask if I'd read them. He already knew. "You read fast," he observed, and there was a softness in his voice that had no place in the rest of his life. "I had to," I said. "There's so much—" The anger rose like steam in my chest. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Some truths are foolishly polite," he said. "Or bought." He sat on the edge of the bed, his silhouette carved sharp against the window. "And sometimes people protect you from the ugliness because they think it's mercy." "Mercy is being honest," I said, looking at the numbers again as if they might rearrange themselves into innocence. "Mercy is letting someone choose." He pinched the bridge of his nose, a small human gesture that made him less like a legend and more like a man who'd been wrestling with grief for a long time. "I couldn't get to you the other ways," he said. "I tried, warnings, phone calls, a dozen small things that never landed for the life you wore. You could have let me decide then." The words were sharp. I didn't hide the sting. He nodded, slow and without defense. "Maybe. Maybe I asked with a clenched fist when what you needed was someone to offer you an open hand. I am a terrible diplomat." "You're not terrible at other things," I murmured, thinking of his efficient silence, of how the men around him moved without noise. For the first time, the thought came without judgment, a small, dangerous tenderness. He tracked my face as if cataloging features for safekeeping. "You're kinder than you let yourself be." "You assume a lot about me," I teased. But the smile that flickered across my mouth was real. He liked that. The way he liked things was always a careful, private assessment, never a parade. Working with Dante, working around his methods and his men, revealed another layer of him. He could be violent and careful in the same breath. He could order a raid with the same casuality with which he poured coffee. The contradictions did not cancel each other. They made him more complicated, more human, and more dangerous. I found that the edges of him drew me in like a magnet and repelled me like heat. We discovered the first firm link to Etienne's, laundering in the back pages of a ledger hidden behind. Invoices for flowers and catering, an irony that tightened my chest. The paper trail led to a warehouse outside the city, a place with a humming generator and boxes that smelled faintly of oil and money. Dante decided we would go that night. He planned with the precision of a chess player. I insisted on coming, though not from bravado. I wanted to see, to know with my own eyes what had been done in my name. Luca's look when I announced I was going was not approval, but calculation. "You don't have to," he said. "We will do it." "No," I replied. "I want to." He didn't argue. He set a jacket over my shoulders like a shield and looped my hair back, the motion domestic and precise. For a second, we were two people whose lives had not been scandalized, and the tenderness of that almost undid me. The warehouse smelled of diesel and paper and the low electric hum of a place waiting for a deadline. Men moved in shadows. Files shifted. A photograph I found inside an envelope made everything less hypothetical. Etienne smiling, shaking hands with a man whose eyes were empty with calculation. Under the photograph, a note. Payment received. Shipment scheduled. The discovery landed like a stone. We had proof. When we left the warehouse, wet from the night and lit by street lamps, an orange light flashed across Dante's face and made the scar beneath his jaw look darker. His jaw clenched when we got into the car, but he said nothing. The driver took us to the villa like an arrow, silent and straight. Back at the house, adrenaline lingered in my limbs like a second skin. Dante's hand found mine in the hallway, a small private anchor. He didn't speak until we were in the kitchen, breathing steam and the metallic scent of adrenaline. "You did well," he said finally. "You mean I followed you into a raid?" I replied. "I'm not sure that counts as well." "Courage and curiosity look very similar in the dark," he said. There was a softness in the way he said it that warmed something inside me. I reached out, absently smoothing a crease at his sleeve. The gesture felt scandalously intimate. He leaned into it like someone who'd been starved for simple touch. The next morning arrived with gunfire in the air, sharp and impossibly close. Etienne, cornered and desperate, had not been idle. He had men who could be bought by fear, and fear had a way of generosity when it comes to betrayal. They came under cover of fog. 2 cars at the gate, engines muted, men with faces like knives. The alert sounded as someone shouted down the corridors, quickly, decisively, "Intruders." Dante's men moved like wolves. Luca called orders, a low, efficient voice. Dante stripped off to fight with the absence of hesitation. I should have run. I should have hidden. Instead, I stood rooted where I was, a small human beacon in a house full of danger. My chest thudded loud enough to be a drum. Danger and clarity in the same beat. The first blast cracked the large window in the sitting room. Glass rained across the rug like frozen confetti. Dante was at my side in a motion that felt like instinct. He pulled me down, pressed me behind a sofa, his body a shield over mine. The press of him was not violent. It was a promise of defense. My fingers dug into his sleeve until my nails hurt. He didn't flinch. When one of Etienne's men breached the hallway, Luca was there, swift and silent. A shot rang out, then another. Dante moved with the lethal calm of someone who'd rehearsed the steps 100 times. He covered the men, checked the windows, found the path to safety. The chaos was quick and brutal. The men left with one message: power moves are dangerous games. After the dust settled, I discovered a trickle of blood along Dante's collarbone. The sight of it slammed into me with an animal panic. For a wild second, I thought the whole charade had been for nothing. He'd been wounded protecting us, protecting me. The realization carved open something in me that had been folded tight for so long. I tore off a strip of linen and pressed it to the wound, hands steady with a new kind of purpose. Dante watched me with an odd expression. Not surprise, but something softer, as if he'd been hoping for this exact human response. "Why are you here?" he asked later that night, as I pressed stitches into his shoulder in the small infirmary Luca kept for such things. The lamp threw a pool of light over his skin. The scar at his throat showed like a thin moon. "Because I want to," I said simply. "Because I chose, after the church and after the papers, to be in the truth." My hands were careful, intentional. When I looked up, his face had changed. The armor slipped like a curtain. "You chose danger," he said. "And you chose to bring it to me," I countered. "But when you showed me the ledger, you offered me choice. You didn't force me to accept." He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and searched my face like someone reading a map. "So you choose me?" The question was ridiculous in its bluntness. It was tender in its unadorned simplicity. I set the needle down, reached out, and took his hand. His skin was warm, still trembling from pain. "I choose the truth," I said. "And if the truth brings you with it, then yes." He laughed, a sound that was more relief than humor. "You make decisions like an avenging angel," he said. "Only the messy parts," I replied. In the days that followed, our equilibrium shifted from investigation to preparation. Each ledger, each wire transfer, each name marking the edges of a plan that would bring Etienne to light. Luca watched us with a protective jealousy that made his jaw tight. He relented when I, plucked courage from fear and began to move as a partner rather than a bystander. By the end of Act 2, the evidence was laid out on the long table in the study. Names linked, accounts traced, an undeniable web. Dante looked at me across the paper like someone seeing the woman he'd collected into his life and thought, quietly, that she belonged in the center of a future he'd only imagined in fragments. Standing there, fingers stained with ink and candle wax, I realized how far I had come. From a rehearsed smile in a cathedral to a woman who touched a man's blood and steadied his breath. From hatred to rage to something that tasted suspiciously like care. When Etienne finally made his move, storming the gates with more men than he'd show his face with earlier, we were ready. Not because we were violent, but because we had prepared the truth. And truth, I learned, can be its own kind of weapon. We were ready to face him. Not as victims, not as pawns, but as people who had wrenched their own stories back into their hands. Night tightened over the villa like a fist. We had pulled the house into a map of strategy. Rooms cleared, doors bolted, cameras angled, names circled in black ink on paper that smelled of dust and truth. The long table in the study was a battlefield of documents, ledgers, emails, invoices, a confession file that read worse than any of us had dared imagine. It was a thing of paper and consequence, and it felt heavier than any weapon. Dante moved through those papers with the patience of someone handling relics. He did not rage. He catalogued. He made lists where others made curses. Luca stood by him, a constant shadow, jaw set like metal. I sat at the head of the table, fingers stained by ink, and by the tremor of adrenaline that would not leave. "Tonight," Dante said, "we give him a choice." Etienne had been loud in his arrogance. He hadn't expected the ledger to be found. Not by me, and certainly not by anyone who would act. Men like him assume silence is their ally. He assumed I would perform stillness at some altar forever. He had misread how a woman might fold truth into a fist and hurl it. The hour came earlier than any of us wanted. A light rain began to sweep the gardens. The sky held the last thin blue of dusk. The first car arrived like a viper. Etienne's men, faces tight, posture the exact kind of entitlement that comes with thinking someone else will fix your mess. Etienne followed with a swagger that had once been charming. Tonight it read naked. Naked in the way people look when they realize their costume has been burned. He pushed through the gate and stepped into the courtyard, as if he owned the light itself. "This is a private residence," he said, voice high with the arrogance of denial. "What is the meaning of Etienne?" Dante said, word simple, pronunciation like a blade. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You ruined my wedding," I heard Etienne say later, as if the night belonged to him because he'd carved it in expectation and invitation. The men behind him made threats small and big, the cheap kind, and the kind that required action. Their shoes scuffed the gravel in a rhythm that promised violence. We had prepared for threats, and for men with blustering confidence. We had not prepared for the trembling in my own hands when Etienne's gaze landed on me, a look full of proprietorial confusion. He expected to terrify me. He expected me to return to the architecture of the life he'd built. He did not reckon with the ledger. Dante stepped out into the courtyard, like a thing that had been called back into the open. He wore no ceremonial armor. He wore only the same quiet I'd learned to read, the reserve of someone who had learned the cost of losing control. Luca took a place by his side. The men in suits flanked them. Not thugs, but a defense force with all the terrifying efficiency of people who'd never been asked to look away. "You sold my family's name," Dante said to Etienne. His voice carried across the stone, held steady. "You forged invoices. You used funerals as bookkeeping entries. You made contracts out of human loss." Etienne laughed. The sound cracked. "You think this will change anything? You show up to a wedding in a trench coat and make declarations and expect the world to change? That's not what we expect," Dante said. "We expect you to answer. People talk about courage as if it is a single heroic thing. But courage is mostly the accumulation of small, stubborn acts. The filing of a complaint, the act of opening an inbox, the decision to tell someone what happened." I stepped forward then, my heels on cold stone, my wedding dress gone like a memory that could be folded into a pocket. The file sat heavy in my hands. "You've been laundering money through my name," I said, surprising myself with how even my voice sounded. "You put my face in transactions and it made merchants remember me instead of my consent. You built towers on the bones of people who died because you wanted to look clean." The men around Etienne shifted. The air was small enough for the sound of his breath. "Prove it," Etienne said, which was a challenge garbed in desperation. I handed the folder to one of the journalists who'd been lurking at the edge of the property. Cameras already rolling for the sort of scandal that feeds appetites. Dante had thought ahead. There were reporters who wanted to see Etienne fall. There were legal people on retainer waiting outside, slow hands that could move when the right folding of paper met the right light. The camera lights painted us in their unforgiving white. I felt exposed in an almost voyeuristic way, but exposure, I had learned, was a way of breaking the varnish. It burned. It purified. The proof was there. Invoices with forged signatures, transfers linked to shell companies, a breadcrumb trail that ended in melted public trusts. Etienne's men were cornered by clarity. You could see the arithmetic of panic in their faces. "Luca," he whispered to his enforcer. "Take her." There was movement, that terrible immediate motion of men who belong to someone else's will. A pair of hands reached for me, and for a second my old reflex, trained by a life of smiles and courtesy, made me step back. Dante's voice folded over the night. No. It was a small intervention, a single syllable, and yet the hush after it felt enormous. Dante moved with a speed that had nothing to do with theater. He intercepted Etienne's men in a way that spoke of practiced force. There was a flurry of motion, and then the courtyard was a measured chaos. Luca doing what he did best, men falling back, the legal team moving in like tidewater. The scare dissolved as quickly as it had flared. When the dust settled and the cameras kept rolling, Dante pulled Etienne aside. He held him at the edge of the light like a man holding a stubborn animal. For a heartbeat, I thought he would end him. The shape of that temptation was obvious in the way the torchlight carved Dante's cheekbone into a map of wrath. "You could kill me," Etienne said, small and suddenly very mortal. The confession in his voice sounded like a child bargaining with fate. He looked at Dante with a kind of apology that reeked of calculation. "I can buy my way out. I can make it stop. I can make you go away." "Kill me and you lose everything," Dante said softly. "Kill me, and you become a man who had the chance to end this, and chose murder as a ledger entry." For a breath, Dante's hand tightened around Etienne's collar, a gesture that could have ended a life and absolved none of the ghosts. The world held its breath. I could feel the hum of the cameras like a second heartbeat. Then, Dante did the thing that surprised me most. He let go. Not because he thought Etienne deserved mercy, but because he had decided, in some quiet place I could not yet see, that taking another life would not rebuild anything. Killing Etienne would be revenge, yes, but it would be a mirror image of the rot he wanted to bury. To alter the narrative, Dante chose a different kind of violence, the legal exposure of truth, the public accounting of lies. He stepped back and folded his arms like a man who'd chosen a different war. "That," Dante said finally, voice low and bloodless, "is for the courts." He pointed to the men in suits who moved like operators, lawyers, prosecutors, men with badges who had been waiting for the ledger to fall into the right hands. "That is for the law." Etienne's face crumpled the way paper does when water hits it. He had expected blood and spectacle, not slow, bureaucratic justice. He tried for threats that sounded like promises, but the press and the police formed a ring around him strong enough to cancel his swagger. Behind the cameras, someone shouted that units were en route. It felt like the moment of reckoning we'd been planning for. Dante watched the procession of men in blue take statements, the reluctant men in suits exchange glances. He watched with an authorial calm, as if he had set this scene up to be read by people who would later choose what to think. When he returned to me, he was quieter than I had ever seen him. A soldier might be quieter than him, but not a man with such visible stillness. He took my hand then, not in a grip of ownership, but in an affirmation of presence. "You were brave," he said. The phrasing was clumsy with praise, but sincere. In his mouth, praise sounded like a contraband thing. "You were cruel," I answered honestly. "You did not give me a choice until the moment." He nodded. "I know. I'm paying for that. Is there a price that's enough?" I asked. He looked at me like I had asked him to name a star. "I don't think there is." For a beat, we stood in a courtyard full of lights and cameras, and the new, awkward geometry of our lives. Then, as if agreed without speaking, we stepped into the shadow of the car where Luca waited. The villa hummed with activity, men taking statements, the lawyers moving like tide, Etienne being led away with an expression that tried bravado and settled into fear. Dante closed the car door and sat beside me. The world beyond was still loud. Police radios, the distant flash of squad lights, the stunned buzzing of reporters. We had won something that night. Not peace, not absolution, but the thing that comes from exposure, a change in how the story would be written. He reached for my face then, a small, reverent motion. "We leave," he said. "Tonight." "You're not running," I whispered, because I needed to hear the refusal of that story. "We're relocating," he corrected, a small smile flickering like a cracked lighthouse. "There's work left to be done, and someplace I thought of as quiet." We drove away from the villa with the city salting the horizon behind us, channels of light slipping away. I felt the hum of the engine under us, the press of the leather, the safety of Dante's hand clasping mine. The papers were not all closed. Consequences would ripple outward, but the ledger had been opened wide enough for truth to walk through, and that felt like a kind of reparation. As we left, Etienne's face glowed on my phone screen from a breaking news feed, a portrait of a man collapsing into the arithmetic of his choices. I watched, breathing shallow, the adrenaline slow like a receding tide. Dante reached toward me, thumb tracing a line over the knuckle of my hand. "You chose," he said. "I did," I answered. My voice was not steady, but it was honest. "And I choose you." He let out something that was half a laugh, half a relief. "Then stay with me." I closed my eyes. The world was a blur outside the window. Streetlights, the occasional late bar, the slow exposition of a city that had watched me perform a life and now saw me write a different one. In the small dark inside that car, with Dante's fingers warm on my hand, I understood that the worst had been confronted, and the best was still an uncertain country ahead. He kissed me then. Brief. Urgent. A pact written in the language of lips and breath. It tasted faintly of smoke and rain and something I had no word for yet. "We'll go across the border at dawn," he murmured when we pulled away from each other. "We'll begin again." I thought of Paris receding, of the cameras and the priests and the warm, brittle smiles of a life I had left like a costume on the altar. I pressed my forehead to his shoulder and listened to his heart, steady, human, flawed. The road ahead was a fold of unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was traveling with someone who would look at the map with me. Outside, the highway swallowed our taillights. Inside, in the small cathedral of that car, my hand found his and held on. The road out of the villa blurred into a ribbon of headlights and rain. Behind us, the house shrank under the salt glow of police car lights and the steady click of reporters' cameras. Ahead of us, the map folded into something private. Luca drove with the same steady hands he used for unglamorous necessities. Tie loosened, jaw set. Dante sat beside me, quiet, every line in his face smoothed by a brittle calm that made him look 6 years older overnight. "Will they follow?" I asked, because I didn't want to say the thing that throbbed in my chest like an accusation. Will this end? Will the ledger close? Will we ever be safe? He reached for my fingers and squeezed them, the smallest possible anchor. "They'll try," he said, "but we left the paper trail for people who still care about paper." His attempt at humor was small and false and suddenly precious. The absurdity of being alive after that night, alive and driving away from everything familiar in a car with a man who had once been my enemy and now felt very much like choice, made my chest feel like a drum. I didn't want to speak because the words might shatter the fragile thing that had been built out of truth and fury and a strange, slow tenderness. We crossed the border before dawn, the sky a bruise that softened into promise. Dante watched the road, as if the act of looking could fix the past into something that made sense. I watched him watching the road. I found myself cataloging him the way I used to catalog dresses and events. The scar at his jaw, the freckle near his left eye, the small scar on his knuckle that I'd seen that night in the infirmary. Memory stacked into meaning. Once we were over the border, the tension thinned a fraction. The politicians and police and press could measure jurisdiction. Hearts could not. For the first time since the cathedral, I felt something like breath that belonged to me. It was a small, ridiculous thing to crave. The ordinary ritual of buying coffee at a roadside stall and arguing over who would pay. Dante bumbled over the local language with the kind of clumsy grace that unmade his danger in the most human way. "Stay," he asked later, settling in an apartment that smelled faintly of lemon and the sea. The place was modest. 2 rooms, a narrow balcony, and a view where dawn cut across rooftops like a promise. He had rented it with an efficiency that belonged to someone who had always planned for emergency, but never for quiet. Stay where? I teased, though I knew the real question. Stay with him. Stay in a life that had been rebuilt from shards and ledger lines. With me, he said, and the words were soft enough to be private. We will find a rhythm. We will keep doing what we started. Finishing the paperwork, helping those our accounts hurt, holding each other when the nights are hungry. If this was a bargain, it was the least coercive sort. Truth in exchange for effort and, perhaps, love. I thought of Matteo, Dante's brother, and the way grief had taught Dante to be relentless in truth, not in vengeance. I thought of Etienne, small and corrupt and undone. I thought of my own life. The first dress I'd ever loved that fit me only when someone else was directing the seams. The thought of making my days with this man, who had once entered a cathedral like a storm, and now offered lemon-scented mornings, felt quietly revolutionary. Do you ever regret not killing him? I asked one afternoon, because the question lived in me like a hard grain. Dante tilted his head. The light made his eyes look like river glass. Sometimes, he admitted, but I realized killing would have built a house on an old foundation of blood. I wanted different walls. And what are your walls now? I pressed, wanting to catch the image for myself. Transparency, he said. Paper, names. Enough light that men like him cannot hide forever. We worked. Not like detectives on a television program. Our work was less glamorous. Calls to lawyers, late nights tracing transfers we'd missed, arranging for whistleblowers to be protected. We found the small, cruel ways Etienne had tried to obscure the money. Charities with false names, shell corporations whose shells had been built on grief. Each revelation was a small jubilee. An accounting of stolen things returned to the light. There were days when the world felt almost ordinary. We bought a battered kettle, argued over the correct way to make coffee, and I taught him a recipe my mother used to make for Sunday mornings. He laughed when I insisted on adding lemon rind to the batter. He learned small kindnesses with a reverence that made me feel like the world had been invented new for us. The legal moves followed. The lawyers I'd trusted in Paris were replaced by ones who moved across borders with the same efficiency as Dante's men. In their hands, the files we'd assembled became petitions, summonses, and the steady drum of due process. Etienne fought back, lawyers with loud suits and louder mouths, but the ledger had been opened, and once ink touched paper, it could not easily be erased. Then, the day of reckoning. A court in a small city where the public gallery was crowded with people who had felt the indirect effects of Etienne's deals. Small shopkeepers. A widow whose husband had been left without employment. A man who'd sold his family heirloom because a factory closed overnight. They had come to see a man pay for a lifetime of making others vanish. I sat in the gallery, Dante beside me, fingers entwined, and I watched the man who had been my groom stand in a suit that no longer fit the person he was. He looked smaller in the light of public accountability, and the thing that took me by surprise was not the pleasure in seeing him diminished. It was the sorrow at what his choices had cost others. Justice was not celebration. It was repair, ugly and slow and necessary. When the ruling came, it felt like a weight is finally set where it belongs. There was no grand triumphant speech. There was only the long, bureaucratic reading of consequences. Etienne would pay fines. He would face restitution. Some of his men faced jail time. Some fled. The practicalities of punishment felt anticlimactic and huge at once. Justice, it appears, is less cinematic than ledger lines, but it has a way of quietly stitching broken things back together. After the hearing, reporters did their rounds, and cameras found us on the steps. Someone thrust a microphone toward me. The moment felt cinematic in a way the night at the cathedral had been. Light glaring, the crowd ready to swallow our private decision whole. What now? The reporter asked, camera aiming for every nuance. I looked at Dante. He looked at me. We had both been actors and audiences in each other's stories, and there was a new sort of intimacy in the exchange. We keep doing the work, I said. We help where we can, and we live our lives. It sounded smaller than it felt. And that was exactly right. The work of making a life is often made up of small promises kept. That evening, as the sun slid into a bruised line, We walked along a promontory above the sea. The city glowed under the dusk like a promise we'd survived. The air smelled of salt and citrus and the faint smoke of someone's late cooking. Dante stopped and turned to me. "You still have your ring," he said. His voice carried a question. I looked down at my hand. The band was gone. I'd taken it off on the night we fled. "I left it," I said. It felt like someone else's weight. He smiled, and something in his face opened that told me every ledger and scar had led to this small forgiveness. He bent and took my hand, not to claim it but to hold it. "Stay," he said again, and this time it wasn't urgent. It was an invitation. I let him. I watched the horizon turn the color of new paper, the sea folding light like a blank page. I thought of Matteo and Dante's grief, and the ledger that had once been a weapon, and now was a tool for repair. I thought of Etienne, diminished but not destroyed, and the unpleasant truth that life winds on. I thought of how often I'd pretended that safety meant stillness, and how many ways the truth had shown that safety is sometimes the work of edges and questions and brave, imperfect people. We walked in silence for a while, our steps in time, and in the quiet I felt the soft thrum of something true. Not the thunderous, sweeping declarations of love written for other people's stories, but the small, stubborn mutual choices that make a life. When we reached the car, Dante leaned in and kissed me, gentle, deliberate, a promise without fanfare. It tasted faintly of lemons and rain, and the smoke that had always clung to him. His hand found the hollow beneath my neck and held me like a lighthouse holds its light. "We start over," he murmured. I watched Paris recede in the rear view, the lights dim until they were a smear of gold. My ring was gone, but his hand was warm in mine. The road ahead was uncertain and full of dangers I could not yet name. But standing at the edge of the border, with salt in the air and a man who had been both ruin and refuge beside me, I could say the thing that had become true across the ledger and the storms. I wasn't kidnapped. I was found, and that finally felt like a beginning.